you know, we broached on the subject of being overfat, and I'd really like to have a, you know, get into that a little bit about, you know, what is being overfat? How do we measure it? How did we get to be overfat? Why it's important that we acknowledge it? Just, you know, there's a whole lot of things around that.
Yeah, overfat is a state, a metabolic state, an imbalanced metabolic state, and it's the accumulation of excess body fat. So overfat is excess body fat that impairs health. And when we have too many fat cells, they literally become sick. They literally lose their ability to do their job. And fat cells in the body are not just sitting there doing nothing. They actually are very important parts of our metabolism, our anatomy, and they play a very important role. They communicate with all the other organs and glands, and including our brain. So, and our brain is 65% fat. So one of the things that excess body fat does, not unlike people who are under fat, where they don't have enough fat when they're starving, they also get the same type of sick body fat, although there's not a lot of it. But body fat is a very important group, a very important system for our immunity. And so there's a lot of immune cells in body fat. And when we have healthy levels of body fat, that immune function is very important to resist infections from viruses and bacteria and other microbes. And the most common reason for excess body fat today is the consumption of refined carbohydrate. So it's the sugars, all the different sugars, and the refined flours, and basically the primary cuisine in the world is refined carbohydrate. And when we consume that, I used to say when we consume that to excess, but really we now know, as the studies show, the scientific studies show, that even one snack of junk food in the form of refined carbohydrates can have measurable damage on our body. And so consuming these products causes that carbohydrate getting into the body. Half of it's converted to fat and goes into storage. And at the same time, the fat we have in storage is unable to be used for energy. That's the whole idea of fat burning. So it's a double whammy, and we just keep accumulating more and more fat to the point where we have excess and we're over fat. And so I've been publishing studies on this for quite a while, and the last paper I published with my colleague Paul Larson, who's sort of well known there in New Zealand, even though he's a Canadian.
He's at AUT, isn't he?
He is,
Yeah.
he was. He's still affiliated with them. But Paul and I have done a lot of work together, and after seeing a lot of the latest research, I thought to myself, well, the studies that we published a few years ago saying that 76% of the world was over fat was way too conservative.
Oh, I think that's the last one I read. Was that like 2017, that study that you published? Was that the last one you did? Or?
Well, no, the last one just came out a couple of months ago.
Okay, so
it's called Revising the Overfat Pandemic.
And I think I read, see, 2017 study, I think I've read that you and he co-authored about overfat, and that you had like 62 to 76% of the world's population were overfat.
Correct. That was the one where we defined overfat and underfat.
Yeah.
And 76%. And I had always used the figure of 75% over the last 15, 20 years. And people would say, well, how do you come up with those numbers? And I would just mentally run through how I came up with that. And I just thought, let's put this down scientifically. And we did, and came up with those numbers. And they were very conservative. But I had people say to me, 76, that's a high number. That can't be right. And all of a sudden, earlier this year, I keep up with all the studies. I saw studies on different populations and what the body fat levels were doing. And I just started putting 2 and 2 together, and I said, hey, the number is higher than 76. It's higher than 80.
Wow.
I did a study in India and showed that 80% of Indian adults were overfat. And so that's frightening. That's just frightening. And if we look around at different populations, Indians are South Asians. And if we move over to China, we see those Southern Chinese tend to be overfat at very high levels. And so the world in its entirety is certainly over 80% body fat. And some of the Western countries like the US is 91%, which is one reason why the US has so many COVID cases, I believe.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's been an interesting aspect of COVID, hasn't it? Has been the underlying sort of morbidity, that really dramatically increases the risk, and, your immune system's compromised. And
this is where the energy should be directed, not only by individuals like us, but people who are helping other people, but also governmental agencies and the media. And instead they're not addressing the causes of the problem. Pandemics don't just happen. People don't just get sick. We're not walking down the street and a virus jumps on us and makes us sick. It doesn't work that way. If it did, humans would have died out a long, long time ago.
Yeah.
Instead, we have this really wonderful immune system, which really enlists the whole body. We think of it as this little system, but so many parts of us are playing a role in immunity. But we have a great immune system that fights off every day, every moment, fights off all these microbes that are in us and around us all the time. And when our immune system is not up to working right, when we have a poor immune system, we tend to get sick. And so, they talk about COVID and the people who were susceptible and the comorbidities, so people with diabetes and cancer and heart disease and respiratory disease, they are the vulnerable ones. Well, what causes those conditions? Being overfat. So let's not say anything about those comorbidities. Let's say, the people who are most vulnerable to COVID-19 are the people who are overfat. And we published a paper on that just recently.
And you've identified 91% of the US population are overfat.
Yeah. And so it's, we live in a society, and we have a healthcare society in a sense that treats symptoms. And we never want to address what's causing the problem or what's more of a priority. We want to do the patchwork. We want to wait for people to get heart disease. And then we have these wonderful remedies, including
like statins
a new heart. You know,
Yeah,
don't
yeah.
worry about it. You know, when you need a new heart,
We'll
there's
just
probably
give
going
you
to be one
one.
available.
Yeah, 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 for sure. So people will say, oh, I don't believe it, 91% of people aren't over fat. So do you want to would you define that a little bit? Because we're not talking about weight, are we? And I think that's a very important distinction to make. We're not talking about how much you weigh on the scales.
It's very important, and it's what so much of the world has been ignoring, and when you read about things in the media, or when you read a World Health Organization report, you typically see the word overweight and the word obesity, which is very misleading, because a lot of people who are normal weight and non-obese can be overfat. In fact, what the study in India showed for the first time is that 40% of normal weight, non-obese Indian adults were overfat. That's astounding. And then suddenly those studies in other populations started showing, and that's when I said, we've got to write a revised overfat
Paper.
pandemic, because we're missing a lot of people. When I originally estimated the world overfat prevalence at up to 76%, we were using 20 to 25% of normal weight non-obese people, because that's what the studies were showing. But they were only showing it in a very narrow population.
Right.
And so now we can look at the, all the ethnicities and the whole world and say, well, this is what happens in India, and 40% of normal weight non-obese people are overfat. So what the bottom line is the weight you are is not relevant. And all these obesity levels, they have several levels of obesity, are really irrelevant. And these are obesity is based on BMI, body mass index, which is weight dependent. And they are missing the point, and we've known they've been missing the point for decades. And the scientific community knows the inaccuracy of BMI and all of this, but they don't want to do anything about it, partly because they're very traditional.
Yeah.
And so you don't want to, well, we've been talking about obesity, let's keep talking about it. But partly because there's so much data on obese populations and overweight population. And if you're a researcher, it's a lot easier to get funded if you're going to do something that has a lot of data backing up what your theory is all about. So, and the media is used to that, and so everybody goes along for the ride, and it's an unfortunate situation, because what happens is now the healthcare practitioners are talking to patients, and they'll see people who are maybe a little bigger than they should be around the waist, and they weigh them and they say, well, your weight's okay, but just be careful. Well, it's like, okay, come back next year. You don't have heart disease now, but come back next year. We'll see if you have heart disease then. That model has not worked.
Well, I mean, it's obviously hasn't been working. I mean, it's just got, the more diet books, the more processed food, and the obesity is just, got more and more and more. I remember when I was at school, I went to school with about 400 kids, and I think we had like 4 or 5 kids who were fat kids in the whole school, and I could still say their names today, because and they probably weren't fat by today's standards at all.
It's we need to revamp a lot of things, but our terminology is one, because it's it's how we can help people. It's how we can help the world.
So how do we change the narrative? Because, you know, we have to be so careful. People get very upset, and we were just talking, you know, a little bit earlier about people being in denial as well. I know in my work, and you know, I talk about New Zealand statistics, and I really annoy people by doing that. And people say, I'm sick of hearing the stats. I don't want to know the stats. And they talk as if it's always somebody else who has the problem and it's not them.
Yeah, and New Zealand is very high in their overfat population. So
Well, we're increasing dramatically, aren't we? I think
yeah,
we're increasing probably the fastest in the world. I think I have read. You know, we're increasing very dramatically.
It's possible, but again, they don't want to look at it like you say. They want to focus on, oh, there's a diabetes epidemic, or there's a, you know, I mean, they're getting used to the heart disease problem, and so less and less people talk about it now. The real problem, and what will eventually cause the whole healthcare system to crash, is the money being spent to treat preventable problems that could have been avoided by making some relatively minor changes in lifestyle, not just on an individual level, but on a policy level, just like people thought we were doing with tobacco. We thought we were suing the tobacco industry, and we're winning the battle. Well, that's just not happening. That's the image. The tobacco industry, like I said, they're alive and well and making more money than ever, but they keep saying still, we don't know if smoking cigarettes is harmful. We need to do more studies. At the same time, on their website, they say, you know, tobacco, smoking cigarettes and using tobacco is dangerous because they were forced to say that. But they also say, well, we need more studies because we're not really sure.
That's quite frightening, really, isn't it? Really,
it is.
Given the evidence.
Big Sugar is doing the same thing, and we're allowing it.
Well, Big I mean, I've seen. I mean, Coke say Coke is part of a healthy diet and exercise program. I mean, that's part of their advertising slogans.
Sure, you could say anything you want. You could put heroin in a product and say we have natural heroin. You know, as long as you take it in moderation, you won't die. That's exactly what's going on, and the heroin model is one. The heroin addict model is one that I use because heroin addicts have these things they say when you confront them about their addiction and what are you going to do, blah blah blah, and you know, people say the same things about sugar. Oh, I could stop anytime I want. I don't really have to have it. Oh, I've really cut back. I only have it on Fridays and Sundays. Well, do you mean heroin or sugar? Oh, it's the same thing. So, you know, we have this cultural obsession with coming up with reasons why we don't have to do what we should be doing to be healthy and avoid preventable conditions. You know, most people in the world today, as much as COVID has really grabbed the headlines, the infectious disease problem that existed in developing countries for decades is pretty much gone. Developing countries, just like developed countries, now are dying of the same diseases: heart disease, diabetes, cancer, Alzheimer's, all these preventable diseases. So most people in the world today are going to die from chronic disease, which comes from inflammation, which we'll get back to, uh, from infectious diseases that keep hanging around, like COVID.
Yeah.
And then the third leg in that three-legged stool is physical impairment and pain. Those are the three things that almost everyone is going to have and contribute to lower quality of life and death. And it's all preventable. Most of it, 99% of it is preventable. And in most cases, the cause is sugar and refined carbohydrates leading to excess body fat.
Mm. So with body fat, what's the difference between subcutaneous fat and visceral fat? Because when we're talking about being over fat, we're really focusing more on abdominal and then that visceral and ectopic fat, aren't we? The fat around the organs and things like that.
Yeah, there are fat depots all over the body, and they serve a very important purpose physically for protection. You know, when we go out for a jog, the fat around our kidneys keeps us from doing damage. The fat at the bottoms of our feet protect the bones when we walk, whether we're barefoot or in shoes. We've got fat around the heart that helps it, and so that fat is not just metabolically active and important for the immune system, but physically helps us. It regulates temperature and does all kinds of things. And the location of fat is important because when we have too much of certain fat in certain areas, it's more inflammatory than other areas. So if we have excess body fat all over, then the fat in our abdomen compared to the fat in our thigh, for example, functions differently. It's metabolically more active, that fat in the abdomen, and it produces more inflammation. So it's more dangerous. But it's almost academic because you don't control the where that excess fat goes. To some extent, you control the amount, but you don't control where it goes. The body just fills up your fat depots. But there's some interesting things. One is the abdominal fat, the fat around the waist, we'll just call it that, is very inflammatory, which then it releases inflammatory chemicals that go throughout the body. It affects the brain, it affects the joints, it affects the intestines. But the indication of that abdominal fat also tells us that it reflects excess body fat around the heart as well. And that has the same damaging effect, but it also affects the heart in particular because the heart is covered by this excess fat. And for many years, we've known for a long time that we could measure the amount of body fat accurately through some testings like a DEXA scan, which I don't recommend people doing unless you're doing a scientific study. I used to have a water weight scale in my clinic many years ago, which was a big pool, and people would get in and there'd be a scale and they'd exhale all their air from their lungs and they would sink. We'd weigh them. That was a pretty accurate measure. And then through the years, we've had waist to hip ratio, and we've had all kinds of, pinch and inch and all these calipers and all these gadgets, most of which are totally inaccurate. And what we're left with today, in the last 10 years, the research has borne this out, is the waist to height ratio is the best way for people to determine whether they're over fat or not. And it's really, really very simple. And it's that if you measure your waist at the level of the umbilicus, the belly button, and measure your height, don't look at your driver's license because most people lie about their height. Measure your height. Also, people shrink. And make a ratio. And basically, your waist should be less than half your height. And if it's not, then you're classified as overfat. It's as simple as that. Throw away your bathroom scale because it doesn't mean anything. You're just weighing water, and it's not giving you any idea of body fat. In fact, I've had many, many patients when I was in practice who we would finally get to lose body fat. They'd have to buy new clothes, which they would complain about. But, you know, they were losing a lot of body fat, and I would encourage them to not get on the scale. And somebody invariably would say, hey, are you losing weight? You look like you're losing weight. And they'd say, well, I don't know, but I'm a lot thinner. And then they go home and get on the scale, and they sometimes see that they haven't lost any weight, but they've lost 3 inches on their waist. That's a real possibility. So it's a confusing thing, the scale weight, and it's best to dispose of that idea of weight and the physical device that is in everyone's home except for mine, maybe not yours, but but let's not do that. Let's look at the cause of these problems.
And then maybe once a month or once every couple of months, just rechecking your waist measurement. Or, I mean, I always just say to people, gosh, if you've got to buy new clothes because you've grown out of them. I mean, that's always been my, oh gosh, my jeans feel a bit tighter today,
Yeah, the overfat condition does a lot of things to people. It not only expands their body, especially the waist, but it's associated with other symptoms like hunger, fatigue, mental stress, and poor endurance. And so as these things get better, you're burning more fat. And as you get smaller, and if you have to buy new clothes, you're burning more fat. But that waist to height ratio, and you only have to measure your height once, but like you say, once a month or every couple of months, don't do it every day. Put that measure around your waist at the level of the belly button and just check yourself. And you'll see that with one, gosh, they make being healthy so complicated. With one simple recommendation, don't eat sugar and other junk food.
Yeah.
That's all. Just do that. You will see dramatic changes in body fat being reduced. And that's an important thing. It's a lesson I learned early in one of my first patients, which is to keep it simple. People are already confused about health and about fitness and what about this and what about protein? Well, what kind isn't saturated fat bad? Well, what about this? And coconut oil is supposed to be the worst thing. If it was, I wouldn't eat it every day. And they have all these, it gets in their minds way too complicated. And a lot of people say, well, I don't know what to do. I'm just going to keep eating my junk food because it's comfort food. At least I'll mentally feel better, which is not true, but they think they're feeling better.
Emotionally, I'll feel better.
Emotionally, maybe. But I had a patient who was an executive at a big New York City company who came in to see me, and we did all kinds of tests, and I sat him down and I said, look, here's what we found. There's some problems that need to be addressed. They're serious, but they're all correctable. And here's what you can do. And I talked about exercise, and I said, these are the kinds of things you can do, and the heart rate, and check, do this and buy those kinds of shoes. And then we went to diet, and I said, well, natural fats are good, do this, and make sure you have these proteins from whole proteins, not so much from plant proteins, and then stress management, take a break, and we, and he was very attentive, and he was taking notes, and he never came back. And I talked to, he had referred me a lot of people, and I one day talked to one of them, and I said, well, he never came back. I didn't understand what happened. And the guy said, well, he was overwhelmed with your recommendations. And so I realized that we need to keep it simple. What should we do first? If you're smoking cigarettes, drinking too much alcohol, you're over fat, and you're depressed, what do we do first? What we do is we get rid of the sugar, because that will take care of all the other problems. It'll make quitting smoking easier.
Yeah.
It'll make reducing alcohol easier. It'll reduce your body fat. It'll reduce your risk of heart disease, diabetes, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
And so, it gets a little boring when people keep hearing that same
message
recommendation. It's like, well, what do we do about this rising rate of whatever condition? Well, don't ask Maffetone, because he'll just say, stop eating sugar.
Yeah. Stop eating those processed carbohydrates you're buying.
It doesn't, it doesn't get any easier than that, but people are not doing it in most cases, and it's sad.
I wonder if there's an aspect of human nature about that. We don't want it to be so simple. We don't want it to be something that is so within our control, or something that then we realize we actually aren't really controlling. Like you're saying about the heroin, we're addicted. The sugar has the same effect on our brain. And so we want more complicated, complex solutions, that we can wrestle with and get prepared for, rather than do something really simple.
Yeah, I mean, if you're going to write a diet book, how much is there to say?
Yeah.
1-2 pages of information. So there's got to be a bunch of filling material that has cool sounding words and new cute terminology,
concepts,
concepts, and what would your mother think? And come on. Is that where we've gotten to in society? On that level where we need to play that game. It's sad if it is, and it is, but I think people often just need to stop and think. That's what humans have done from the beginning, and we've done quite well for ourselves until now. And we have these excuses, we have these reasons why we need to discuss this thing. Well, what is it about sweets and this addiction I have? Let's talk about this. Just stop eating sugar.
Interesting. It's a real dilemma. I mean, it's a real problem. We're going to have to do something about it soon. We're self-employed.
Well, I think
soon.
there are two ways to attack it. One is that if governments want to keep spending the trillions and trillions, the tens of trillions of dollars regularly on treating people who have preventable diseases, which they can't afford, but they keep doing it, then the system is going to crash. So the governments, the organizations can come together and say, hey, there's a consensus on what to do. Stop eating sugar, which there is a consensus. Who in the scientific community would argue that junk food is bad? And so we're gonna ban advertising of junk food. We're not going to sell it to people under age 21. We're going to pay people to not eat it as long as they have measurable improvements. These are all things that have been used before and work very well. And if we only did that, we'd save trillions of dollars every year. It wouldn't cost us anything. And so that's the one area that we can solve the problem. The other area is you and me. It's all about you and me. It's an individual issue. We would like to say to ourselves and maybe help other people to address this problem as individuals. And that makes it a grassroots thing, and that's how change is made, by one person saying, hey, look what I'm doing, it's helping. Oh, okay, let's tell them, okay. And then as the years go by, all of a sudden everyone is making those changes and it's actually working, and we have a much better world. What a concept. That's how it's always worked. And so between the two, they're both going to be important, but we can't wait for governments to step in and say, okay, we've got to put an end to this. But we can step in ourselves and make the changes that are simple to make on paper. Sure, sugar addiction's tough. We've all gone through it, those of us who have gotten off it, but it's quite doable. And it's really, like you said earlier, it's a choice that people need to make.
Well, we do need to make it. And I think you touched on it a little bit, you were talking a little bit about quality of life, weren't you, and, we have that choice. Are we going to eat this stuff and be overfat and have all these chronic diseases and have a miserable, pain-filled life where we're just taking medication and our whole life is spent talking about how sick we are and our next doctor's visit? Or we're going to be, physiologically sound and active and, be able to get out there and do stuff.
We want to be functional human beings. We have, for me personally, I feel I have a lot left to do in my life. My brain is, I don't think my brain has reached a peak yet. I'm still climbing. I've got so many things I want to do and so many people I still want to help. And for me, it's very important. And people need to understand that is a natural way to think. And so, we want to see our children grow up. We want to see our grandchildren grow up. We want to start to see our great-great-grandchildren grow up as well.
Well, see, people make comments. I know I get comments regularly. Oh, it's all right for you. You find it easy, I'm like, do you know how much I hate exercising? And I do it every day of my life, for my whole life. But do you know how much I really hate putting those shoes on and starting? But I know afterwards I'm going to feel good. And I just do it. And while my brain is complaining to myself, I'm putting my shorts and my shoes on. And you don't need to do this
Yeah,
today.
it's not always easy.
No.
I can tell you that, you know, when I realized that I was a sugar addict, I was about 17, 18 years of age. And I realized that, you know, hey, I've been a sugar addict from birth. I got sugar water as soon as I was born. Then it was downhill from there.
Yeah.
And okay, now at 17, 18 years of age, how am I going to get out of this addiction? And it was not easy. It wasn't easy because I was addicted. It wasn't easy because back then, the foods were so well disguised. You thought you were getting one thing, and then a few years later, you know, we'd hear reports, or the label laws would change. Oh, you can't. You're now. It's against the law to sell a product and put no sugar added. And then we find out, well, the company that made the product added sugar, but the people who packaged it and sold it didn't add sugar, so they put no sugar added.
Yeah.
Those tricks are, similar tricks are used today. But we didn't know that we were eating as much sugar. We thought, you know, we're eating natural foods, we're going to these hippie health food stores that we just assume they're health food stores, so they're not going to have sugar. Well, that's not the way it was. Like today, most of the food in health food stores is junk food. A lot of it has sugar. And so we've had to learn. It's a lot easier today than ever. But it certainly was a struggle. And it took, you know, how long did it take for me to be able to walk by a bakery without looking in and having some dopamine reaction? Years and years.
I still don't think I can do it. I still think I walk by the bakery and go, oh, so good. But you just, every day you make that choice. Every day it's a choice. So it's not easy. I think exercising and not eating that stuff is a lot harder than the alternate, you know, because it's just a choice day after day after day for your whole life.
It is. It is. And I think, you know, I think people get in a vicious cycle where, okay, the brain is not working. I mean, it's that addiction cycle in part, but it's the inability to think rationally about what's going on. It's like any other addiction, you know, if you're an alcoholic or a heroin addict, it's the same thing. You're in this vicious cycle, and you're fine part of that cycle. In another part of that cycle, you think, okay, it's time to give this up. But then all of a sudden, you take a little bit more because that's what you do, and the cycle continues. And breaking the cycle is not always easy, but it's certainly doable. And sugar is not any easier than anything else, but it is a primary stressor for the body, physically, biochemically, and mental, emotionally. And that's the aspect of our lifestyle that should be attacked first.